The morning of the annual Flaxborough Flower Show dawned with that peculiar mixture of punctual fog and civility peculiar to the Lincolnshire market town. Gardeners, florists, and amateur horticulturalists alike had been fussing over their dahlias, marigolds, and begonias since the crack of dawn. For weeks the anticipation had simmered in parlours and the newspaper's town and gossip column, and by 10 o'clock precisely, the hall at St. Mildred's Parish Centre was humming with polite admiration, whispered critiques, and the occasional sigh of parental pride. Inspector Purbright, whose usual Monday routine involved a cup of tea and a carefully folded set of reports, had not initially intended to attend. Yet the allure of Flaxborough's unofficial social pulse, the gentle ripple of gossip, the subtle rivalries barely concealed beneath florally embroidered tablecloths, proved irresistible. He entered quietly through the side door, nodding to Mrs. Delaney, whose fuchsia arrangement had become almost an annual emblem of understated ambition. "Ah, Inspector," she murmured, with a faint upward twitch of her lips. "Here for the dahlias or the drama?" Purbright inclined his head. "I suspect both, Mrs. Delaney." She chuckled, patting the ribbon she hoped would prove victorious. "Well, the judges shall decide on one. The rest of us, we prefer to decide for ourselves." The hall was a symphony of careful clatter, teaspoons tapping saucers, polished shoes shuffling across polished parquet, the rustle of silk hats and taffeta frocks. At the far end, a modest stage had been prepared for the prize giving, with a small brass bell perched like a watchful sentinel. Most of the audience were women with their hats perched at precise angles, while the men drifted uneasily in the background, exchanging opinions about the weather or the price of coal. It was at precisely 10:15 as the judges, Mr. Hargreaves of Hargreaves Hardware, and Miss Lenton, the retired headmistress, bent over a particularly defiant chrysanthemum, that the peculiar event occurred. A scream, high and perfectly measured, echoed through the hall. It came from the direction of the refreshments table, where Sister Mildred, one of the nuns from the nearby convent, had been supervising the arrangement of scones and lemonade. She clutched at her habit with both hands, pale behind the habitual serenity of her veil. On the polished table, amid the delicate china cups, lay a small, peculiar object. A gold ring, unmistakably old-fashioned, with an engraving that caught the light in a troubling, glimmering arc. "That—" she began, but then faltered. The hall turned instantly, a collective rustle of curiosity and mild outrage passing like a gust of wind through the audience. "Good heavens!" muttered Mrs. Delaney, adjusting her hat as though the world had tilted ever so slightly. "Where on earth did that come from?" Purbright approached slowly, careful not to alarm the nuns further. "Sister Mildred," he said gently, "may I inquire when you first noticed this ring?" "It was not here a moment ago," she insisted. Her voice was a curious combination of shock and pious indignation. I've no idea how it appeared. We were arranging the scones, that is all." He examined the ring with discreet attention, noting its simple yet elegant design, the engraving that hinted at personal significance, and a faint smudge along its interior. A fingerprint, perhaps, though nothing more incriminating than a hasty handling. The audience murmured. Lady Craven, whose lace gloves had been the subject of much admiration, leaned forward, whispering to her neighbour. "A ring at a flower show, how odd. One imagines a theft, or perhaps a scandal." "Or misplaced jewellery," her neighbour countered. "One would hope." Yet the spectacle had done its work. Conversations swirled as the hall emptied of some of its more impatient attendees, who were clearly more interested in the novelty of an incident than the cultivation of begonias. Mrs. Delaney, clutching her fuchsia ribbon as though it might anchor her sanity, confided to a small circle, "I thought the day would pass quietly, but apparently one cannot even enjoy a flower show in Flaxborough without incident." Purbright, for his part, took a slow turn around the hall, noting the arrangement of tables, the placements of hats and handbags, and the slightly askew ribbons on the floral exhibits. It was not that he suspected the ring's appearance to be the work of some master criminal. Rather, the manner of its arrival, the quiet audacity, struck him as more than mere chance. He paused beside Sister Mildred, who was now seated, fanning herself with a small embroidered handkerchief. "Do you recall anyone approaching the table before the discovery?" he asked, gently, politely. "Merely the usual," she replied. "The nuns, some parents, a few of the gardeners. Her voice trailed, uncertain. It was a subtle hesitation, easily missed by anyone less attentive than Purbright. And yet, in the measured rhythm of St. Mildred's flower show, it was a hesitation that sang louder than the brass bell perched innocently on the stage. Outside, the wind rustled the trees along Market Street. Inside, the hall hummed with speculation. Lady Craven theorized aloud about thefts of sentimental value, Mr. Hargreaves grumbled about the audacity of unknown intruders, and children whispered that ghosts surely moved among the flowers. Purbright, meanwhile, collected the ring with the utmost care, noting its weight, its slight warmth, and the sense that it had, in some manner, come to the surface not entirely by accident. By 10:30 the flower show proceeded, though with a slight air of caution. Judging resumed, though the whispers never fully ceased. A dahlia was admired not only for its symmetry, but for how it might conceal a misplaced treasure. A marigold was viewed with suspicion, as if it might hide the next small mystery. Purbright stood near the refreshments, observing without intrusion. One could almost measure the town's character in such moments, the readiness to gossip, the polite curiosity, the small flare of indignation, and the underlying current of competitive pride. And beneath it all he sensed the faint, almost imperceptible pulse of something larger. A secret, dormant and waiting, masked in the everyday manners of Flaxborough's citizens. It was, as Purbright would quietly reflect later, the sort of opening that required patience, not haste. The ring, unassuming as it appeared, had a story to tell. And Flaxborough, like all respectable towns, was seldom willing to reveal the full truth in public, preferring instead the safe theatrics of polite alarm. He pocketed the ring with the care of a man handling both evidence and etiquette. Somewhere between the daffodils and the murmuring spectators, the first threads of the day's mystery were weaving themselves, and as the judges approached the dais, unaware of the subtle disruption that had briefly unsettled the town, Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. Even in a town as measured as Flaxborough, small disturbances, like a ring on a scone table, could, if handled delicately, reveal much more than a simple misplaced trinket. And Purbright, patient and politely probing, intended to see exactly what those revelations would be. The news of the ring's discovery travelled through Flaxborough with the peculiar velocity reserved for events that were neither tragic nor wholly entertaining, but just peculiar enough to demand commentary. By mid-morning, the town's high street was a chorus of speculation. At Mrs. Fenwick's haberdashery, two ladies compared their corset laces while debating the morality of a nun finding a ring in a place so public. "It's quite irregular," said one, adjusting her hat with a sternness that suggested the seriousness of civic duty. "A ring appears and nobody knows whose it is. Who can say it wasn't meant for some unsavory purpose?" Across the street, at the butcher's shop, Mr. Harper listened with half an ear while arranging his cured hams. "Nuns and rings," he murmured, shaking his head. "One would think the convent had its own mysteries, but still, a ring in a flower show? Something isn't right." He glanced at the young assistant, who was too polite to comment. Even at the post office, where the daily queue shuffled patiently under the stern eyes of Mrs. Pritchard, the incident had become a topic of murmured conversation. Letters were delivered with careful attention to the precise manner in which one addressed scandal and curiosity. "The sisters," Mrs. Pritchard whispered to a neighbour, "never err in propriety. If Sister Mildred is flustered, it is serious indeed." Meanwhile, Purbright moved with his usual discretion, visiting the hall once more to observe. He noted small details others overlooked, the way Sister Mildred's fingers trembled slightly when arranging the cups, the faint smudge of ink on Lady Craven's gloves, the curious absence of young Mr. Jenkins, who usually lingered near the dais during such events. Each observation was a quiet note, a fragment of understanding. By noon, the initial murmurings of curiosity had grown into mild debate. At the Flaxborough Arms, over pint glasses of bitter, patrons discussed the implications of the ring's appearance with that unique blend of knowledge and conjecture peculiar to townsfolk. Some theorized theft, others accidental misplacement, and a few, more daringly, hinted at romance or intrigue from an earlier age. Each opinion added layers, tangling truth with assumption. Purbright, sipping his tea in the corner, allowed the town to make its assumptions. He did not interrupt, he merely noted them, cataloguing contradictions and agreements alike. He had learned long ago that human nature was a far more reliable witness than any direct testimony, provided one listened attentively and waited for the inconsistencies to reveal themselves. The first interview of consequence occurred in the late afternoon. Sister Mildred, still pale and slightly anxious, met Purbright in the quiet of the parish office. He offered her tea. She declined with the graciousness of habit, and inquired gently about the convent's visitors over the past week. "We have had only our regular benefactors," she replied, speaking slowly as though choosing words for their moral precision. "The children of the parish, the choir director, and, of course, the occasional florist who brings supplies. Nothing unusual." Purbright made no immediate comment, merely observing the way her eyes flicked to a small crucifix on the desk, and then back to him as though seeking reassurance in both faith and decorum. "Was anyone distracted?" he asked finally. "Perhaps during the refreshment arrangement?" She hesitated, a slight quiver in her lips. I suppose Sister Agnes was a little preoccupied. She has been unwell. A minor detail, perhaps, but it lingered in Purbright's mind. Timing, he knew, was often more revealing than intent. The moment when attention faltered could be as telling as any overt act. As evening descended, Purbright took a measured walk through the town. Flaxborough had resumed its usual rhythms, shutters closed against the creeping cold, shopkeepers counting their day's takings, the odd stray dog chasing the echo of its own paws down deserted alleys. Yet beneath the ordinary, a subtle tension persisted. The ring had, invisibly, unsettled the town's equilibrium. It was not mere curiosity, but a disturbance of propriety, a nudge at something unspoken. By the following morning, the investigation's first obvious suspect had emerged, though not yet formally. Young Mr. Jenkins, assistant to the hall's caretaker, had been seen near the refreshments table in the precise interval when the ring was discovered. The town council, ever fond of tidy resolutions, whispered with near unanimity that he was the culprit, perhaps mischievous, perhaps careless, but certainly involved. The police agreed with cautious nods, and even some of the more imaginative gossipers were satisfied. Purbright, however, withheld judgment. He observed Mr. Jenkins quietly, noting the young man's nervous glances, the habitual brushing of his hands against the hems of his trousers, and the faint tremor in his voice when discussing the flower show. None of it spoke of guilt in the clear, damning way assumed by the town. And then, almost imperceptibly, a trivial but odd detail presented itself. In the convent's small garden, near a patch of carefully tended pansies, Purbright noticed a single glove embroidered at the cuff, and unmistakably of the sort Sister Mildred often wore when tending flowers outside the hall. The glove bore a faint smudge of soil and a tiny, barely noticeable tear, enough to suggest recent, careful handling. It was insignificant to anyone else, but Purbright's attention to such minutiae had often revealed more than the loudest confessions. Who had worn the glove? Why had it been left so? And how, he wondered quietly, might it relate to the ring, the scones, and the peculiar hesitation in Sister Mildred's eyes? As the day unfolded, more characters emerged into the field of observation: a visiting florist with a habit of dramatic size, the choir director whose over-attentive gaze suggested unspoken anxieties, and Lady Craven herself, whose refined curiosity bordered on investigative zeal. Each had their grievances, minor scandals, or private routines disturbed by the ring's appearance. By the late afternoon, a second incident occurred. During the routine clearing of the hall after the judging, another small object was discovered beneath a table, a locket, tarnished and aged, its chain broken. It contained a faded photograph of a man whose resemblance to none of the attending townsfolk made the item's presence all the more perplexing. The locket's appearance shifted attention, casting doubt on the neat conclusion surrounding Mr. Jenkins and hinting at a deeper thread. Purbright noted the timing, the placement, and the subtle tremors of those who discovered it. The second incident did not scream for justice. Rather, it whispered of connections, half-remembered stories, and secrets buried beneath the town's veneer of polite propriety. That evening in his study, Purbright reflected on human nature, on the curious ways respectability and secrecy intertwined, and on how minor oversights could reveal far more than overt confessions. The town, he considered, was like the flower arrangements themselves, orderly at first glance, yet full of hidden stems, tangled roots, and occasional blemishes, invisible until one looked closely. He understood, quietly and without urgency, that the answers were not in force or accusation, but in careful, polite observation, in the tiny details people overlooked or attempted to conceal. And as night fell over Flaxborough, the inspector sipped his tea with the measured patience of a man who knew the town would in time reveal all that needed revealing. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the small disturbances, the ring, the glove, the locket, would guide the investigation step by deliberate step toward truths the town itself had almost forgotten it possessed. The morning after the locket's discovery, Flaxborough awoke with the curious mixture of caution and anticipation that had become almost routine in the wake of a minor scandal. Word of the new object had spread rapidly, carried on the soft currents of gossip through the town's cafes, bakeries, and the post office queue. By 10 o'clock, the small network of acquaintances and casual observers had grown into a web of opinions, each embroidered with assumptions and quietly contradictory theories. Purbright, with his usual careful attention to schedule, decided to revisit the hall and the convent. His path took him first to the garden behind the parish centre, where the single glove had been left, and where he hoped to find traces unnoticed by others. The soil was firm and undisturbed, but a faint imprint near the flower bed suggested someone had crouched briefly, perhaps in haste, perhaps to avoid detection. It was a subtle clue, almost too minor to note, yet it reminded him how often human behavior left delicate, invisible signatures. Inside the hall, the locket had been collected and stored in a small velvet bag behind the judge's table. Mr. Hargreaves fussed over it with a mixture of fear and pride, as though the discovery were both an embarrassment to his authority and a testament to his discernment. Miss Lenton, the retired headmistress, offered her own interpretation, speaking in clipped sentences that seemed designed to suggest both gravitas and moral superiority. "One must wonder," she said, eyes fixed on the locket, "whether this is a relic of the past or a deliberate provocation. A child, perhaps, or one of the young men from the town. It is difficult to say." Purbright listened with polite attention, noting every inflection and hesitation. As with Sister Mildred's earlier responses, it was the small, measured signs, the pause before a word, the slight tension in a hand that often revealed more than the words themselves. By mid-morning, the investigation required the expansion of the field. Several new characters emerged from the town's quiet corners, each carrying the weight of personal ambition or long-concealed grudges. The florist, Mr. Aldridge, with his penchant for dramatics, was first to volunteer his recollections. He insisted that he had seen a figure near the refreshment table, a man with a nervous gait, pausing repeatedly as if torn between curiosity and caution. "Could it have been Mr. Jenkins?" asked Purbright casually, knowing full well the town had already drawn its tidy conclusions. Mr. Aldridge's brows knitted. "I cannot be certain. There was something unusual about his posture. Not exactly wrong, but hesitant, as if he knew he should not be there." Later, Purbright visited the convent again. Sister Mildred, in her calm but slightly perturbed manner, was preparing tea for the nuns. Purbright took the opportunity to observe without pressing too directly. Sister Agnes, who had been noted as unwell, moved with surprising agility, her eyes sharp and watchful, while another nun arranged the tea table with meticulous precision. "I do hope no one thinks ill of us," Sister Mildred said quietly, almost to herself. "We are merely caretakers of what is entrusted to us. We do not meddle." "No one here would accuse you lightly," Purbright replied. "Yet it is remarkable how small disturbances can attract attention." She glanced at him, uncertain if the remark was a critique or a gentle observation, then returned to her work. As the morning progressed, Purbright met with the choir director, Mr. Benson, whose nervous energy seemed in constant battle with his otherwise precise demeanour. Mr. Benson had been overseeing the children's choir during the show and reported nothing unusual, yet his hands fidgeted subtly when describing the placement of refreshments and flowers. "It is likely nothing," he insisted. "I cannot imagine why anyone would leave such items here. One hopes it is simply oversight." Purbright said nothing, filing away the information alongside the other observations. By late afternoon, the second incident, the locket, had begun to influence the assumptions of the town council and the police. A tidy explanation for Mr. Jenkins now seemed less certain. Whispers suggested a connection between the ring and the locket, though no one could articulate what that might be. Lady Craven, who had taken a quiet but persistent interest in the matter, began visiting the parish centre under the guise of curiosity, observing the hall and occasionally offering pointed remarks. "Objects appearing in public places often have histories," she said to Purbright at one point, eyes narrowed. "One wonders why such histories are only noticed after they create alarm." Purbright nodded politely, noting her phrasing and the subtle assertion of moral authority that accompanied it. Each remark, however innocuous it appeared, helped shape the perception of the investigation, revealing priorities, assumptions, and unspoken ambitions among Flaxborough's residents. By evening, Purbright had reviewed his growing set of observations. The initial suspect, Mr. Jenkins, remained a figure of polite suspicion, but the appearance of the glove and locket introduced new threads. Each character, Sister Mildred, Sister Agnes, Mr. Aldridge, Mr. Benson, Lady Craven, and the minor, figures who whispered in corners, carried a fragment of understanding, a piece of the puzzle. The town, as always, continued its routines. Shops closed for the day, lights glimmered behind curtains, and the quiet hum of domestic activity carried on as though the incidents were minor disturbances in a well-ordered world. Yet Purbright sensed the subtle shift in rhythm. Flaxborough, which prided itself on measured civility, now contained within its streets and parlours the faint vibrations of something unsaid, something that demanded careful, patient observation. That night, as he prepared his notes, Purbright reflected on the behaviour of the town's residents. Small grievances, private anxieties, and unspoken rivalries often dictated action far more than overt desire or malice. In Flaxborough, it was never the loud declarations but the quiet hesitations, the minor gestures, and the timing of interruptions that revealed the deeper truth. The stage was wider now, the cast more numerous, and the minor disturbances, the ring, the glove, the locket, had begun to interact in ways subtle yet significant. Purbright, patient and politely probing, understood that the coming days would require careful calibration, observation, discreet inquiry, and the gentle prodding that could draw the guilty party into revealing more than they intended. And beneath the calm routines of the town, a single constant remained: human nature, with all its contradictions, secrets, and minute expressions, was always more revealing than the tidy assumptions of gossip or the impatient desire for resolution. Purbright, quietly confident in the power of such observation, prepared for the next steps of the investigation, aware that each new day brought fresh insight, provided one was patient enough to notice it. The day after the locket's discovery, Flaxborough awoke to a light drizzle that seemed almost symbolic, washing the pavements, but leaving the town's curiosity freshly dampened rather than diminished. The flower show had concluded, ribbons and trophies returned to drawers, but the residue of minor scandal lingered. Gossip had become the dominant feature of morning conversation. Shopkeepers, clerks, and the occasional visiting solicitor discussed the ring, the locket, and the strange coincidence of their appearances with a tone of mild scandal that only a town such as Flaxborough could sustain. Inspector Purbright arrived at the parish centre mid-morning, noting the slight tension in the air. The hall, now quiet and mostly cleared of displays, seemed less like a venue for flowers and more like a stage set for small human dramas. Mr. Hargreaves fussed over the arrangement of chairs, while Miss Lenton hovered near the judge's table, casting glances at the velvet bag containing the locket, as though fearful it might walk away on its own. "It seems the town has its own detective now," Purbright remarked lightly to Mr. Hargreaves. Replied the hardware man, dabbing at a chair leg. "I just want things to be in order, that is all." But order, as Purbright knew, had been disrupted. A second incident had occurred that morning, more peculiar, more subtly alarming than the first. In the convent's small herb garden, just beyond the pansies where the glove had been found, Sister Agnes discovered another object, a folded note, aged, with handwriting that suggested someone long familiar with careful concealment. The note was brief, its tone cryptic. "Not everything buried remains forgotten. Seek where the past lies with care." Sister Agnes, pale but composed, handed the note to Sister Mildred, who in turn placed it carefully on the judge's table. The convent, and by extension the town, seemed caught between fascination and apprehension. The note was neither threatening nor overtly scandalous, yet it hinted at concealed histories that had not been intended for public eyes. Purbright arrived shortly after the note had been discovered. He read it quietly, noting the uneven slant of the letters, the slight pressure variation, and the careful folding, details that suggested a deliberate hand, one accustomed to secrecy rather than mischief. "Have you any idea who might have placed this?" he asked Sister Mildred, who shook her head gently. "None," she replied. "We have had no visitors beyond the usual benefactors. It is, puzzling." As Purbright considered the note, he observed the reactions of the few individuals still present. Mr. Aldridge, the florist, lingered near the hall's entrance, fingers nervously adjusting the lapel of his coat. Mr. Benson, the choir director, appeared more restless than usual, tapping lightly at his shoes. Even Lady Craven, who had taken to visiting the hall under the guise of polite curiosity, seemed unsettled, her sharp eyes flicking repeatedly toward the locket and the ring. The note shifted the investigation in ways subtle but undeniable. Mr. Jenkins, still the town's first obvious suspect, now appeared less relevant. There was no evidence linking him to cryptic notes or clandestine movements in the convent garden. The neat, tidy resolution the council had hoped for had begun to dissolve, replaced by a more tangled and complex picture. Purbright, as always, withheld judgment. He spent the afternoon observing, speaking in polite, carefully phrased questions that encouraged disclosure without accusation. A simple remark here, a casual observation there, and subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. Lady Craven, for instance, mentioned in passing that she had seen a shadow near the garden just after the hall had emptied the previous evening. She described it vaguely, almost dismissively, but the phrasing suggested a deliberate avoidance of full disclosure. Mr. Aldridge, when asked about the note, fidgeted and glanced toward the convent with a caution that seemed disproportionate. Even Sister Agnes, though composed, exhibited a minor hesitation when recounting the discovery of the folded paper, a hesitation that might have passed unnoticed to anyone less attentive than Purbright. By late afternoon, the town's reaction had become almost theatrical. At the Flaxborough Arms, a small group of patrons debated the implications of the note. Some insisted it indicated a hidden treasure, others a past scandal, and a few suggested an elaborate jest by one of the more imaginative residents. None, however, suspected that the answer might lie in the quiet, polite patterns of observation rather than in dramatics or accusations. Purbright, meanwhile, returned to his study. He considered the sequence of events, the ring on the refreshment table, the glove in the garden, the locket beneath the stage, and now the folded note. Each was minor when viewed alone, yet together they suggested deliberate placement, almost as if someone wished to manipulate attention to guide the eyes of the town toward certain discoveries while concealing the full truth. The inspector's thoughts wandered, as they often did, into the territory of human nature. Flaxborough's residents, he reflected, were predictable in their polite indignation, their fascination with scandal, and their eagerness to ascribe motive even where none existed. Yet human behavior also revealed its secrets in small, subtle acts, the hesitation before a word, the careful adjustment of a hat, the faint tremor in a hand, or the imperceptible direction of one's gaze. By evening, Purbright had begun formulating a strategy. He would need to observe, inquire, and perhaps stage subtle tests to see who among the town's residents reacted in ways that betrayed knowledge beyond casual observation. The patterns were emerging, but the final shape remained hidden beneath layers of social propriety and polite obfuscation. As night fell, Flaxborough resumed its outward calm. Curtains were drawn, lamps lit, and the quiet hum of domestic life masked the small disturbances that had unsettled the previous day. Yet beneath this appearance of normalcy, the town had changed imperceptibly. The discovery of the note had shifted the focus, unsettled assumptions, and deepened curiosity. Small alliances, minor rivalries, and latent anxieties would now play a role in what promised to be a quietly intricate revelation. Purbright, patient and politely probing, allowed the town's rhythms to proceed undisturbed. He knew that in time, the true sequence of events, the deliberate placements, the minor hesitations, and the human motives would become clear. For now, it was sufficient to note the subtleties, to allow each person's behavior to speak in its own measured, revealing language, and to wait. Tomorrow, he reflected, would bring new observations, new conversations, and perhaps the first signs of those willing, through careless action or conscious design, to expose the truth beneath Flaxborough's neatly ordered surface. And as he retired to his chair, sipping the last of his tea, he smiled faintly at the thought that patience, discretion, and careful observation were often far more revealing than the loudest accusations or the most eager gossip. The second incident had changed everything, or at least everything that mattered. The following morning, Flaxborough awoke to the soft gold of early sunlight breaking through a thin layer of mist. The town's routines unfolded with mechanical precision. Milk bottles clinked against doorsteps, shopkeepers swept pavements with conscientious energy, and the postman navigated the familiar curves of Market Street with polite determination. Yet beneath the surface of everyday order, the events of the previous days, the ring, the glove, the locket, and the folded note, remained a subtle undercurrent, shaping glances, gestures, and whispered conversations. Inspector Purbright, seated at his desk with a fresh cup of tea, reflected quietly on the delicate web of human behavior he had been observing. He considered the nature of Flaxborough itself, a town that valued civility, reputation, and orderly procedure above all else, yet a town in which even the smallest disturbance could ripple unexpectedly through the social fabric. The superficial calm, he knew, often concealed layers of intrigue, subtle rivalries, and long-standing grudges. In particular, he thought of the nuns. Sister Mildred's pale composure, Sister Agnes's controlled agility, and the careful habits observed in the convent suggested a life shaped by discipline and propriety. Yet even within such structured lives, human motives found subtle expression. Hesitations, slight adjustments of habit or hand, the careful positioning of objects, these were the footprints of human nature, just as revealing as the footprints left in soft soil. Purbright's attention drifted to Lady Craven, whose keen eyes had been quietly observing every minor detail at the flower show and in the parish centre. Her curiosity, while politely cloaked in social propriety, was unmistakably precise. One did not watch so carefully without purpose, and the inspector made a mental note to account for her in future observations. Mr. Aldridge, the florist, and Mr. Benson, the choir director, each occupied their own predictable space in the town's social hierarchy. Yet the subtle nervousness they displayed when asked about the glove and the note suggested more than mere surprise or innocent concern. It was the faintest evidence of awareness spoken, hidden beneath the veneer of civility. Purbright's mind returned repeatedly to the sequence of events. The ring had appeared almost ceremoniously on the refreshment table, innocuous and small, but impossible to ignore. The glove, forgotten yet conspicuous in the pansies, hinted at deliberate placement. The locket beneath the stage, containing a photograph of a stranger, introduced an element of the past into the present, complicating assumptions about motives and opportunities. And, finally, the folded note in the herb garden suggested conscious design, as if the unknown orchestrator sought not only attention, but to guide the discovery itself. There was, as Purbright reminded himself, a certain poetry in such arrangements. Crime or disruption in Flaxborough rarely required force. It relied instead on subtlety, timing, and the manipulation of human observation. The inspector sipped his tea and allowed himself a faint smile. He had learned long ago that the town's genteel chaos often revealed more than the loudest outbursts of accusation. Later that morning, Purbright visited the hall once more, under the pretense of examining the locket and the ring. In truth, he sought the reactions of those who moved through the space, careful to note minor gestures, hesitations, and interactions. Mr. Aldridge lingered near the entrance, and the inspector observed the florist's posture, the slight tensing of shoulders, the brief flicker of the eyes toward the velvet bag containing the locket. Mr. Benson, meanwhile, seemed to avoid direct observation, yet the faint tapping of his shoes betrayed anxiety. Even Sister Mildred, ostensibly absorbed in organizing the tea table, displayed subtle clues, the measured way she adjusted the cloths, the gentle but deliberate placement of utensils, and the occasional glance toward the closed bag where the locket rested. Each movement was ordinary in isolation, yet collectively they suggested awareness, anticipation, and a careful attention to propriety that masked curiosity. By early afternoon, Purbright had orchestrated a series of seemingly casual encounters. A polite question here, a quiet remark there, and small hesitations emerged as the town's residents responded to the unexpected attention. Lady Craven, noticing him approach the hall with no pressing reason, offered a carefully neutral smile. "Inspector, I trust the town remains in your capable hands?" she inquired, as though testing his awareness of subtle social cues. "It seems so, Lady Craven," Purbright replied evenly, observing the faint lift of her brow. "Though even in well-ordered towns one finds unexpected events." She nodded, apparently satisfied with the ambiguity of the response, yet the careful glance she cast toward the locket suggested she had noted every word. As evening approached, Purbright returned to his study to review the day's observations. He considered the timing of each incident, the interactions between individuals, and the minute details that others might have overlooked, the tremor of a hand, the flicker of a gaze, the slight hesitation before answering a question. Each observation, he knew, was a piece of the larger pattern, a thread that, when traced carefully, would reveal the orchestration behind the seemingly random disturbances. In Flaxborough, appearances were valued above all else, yet beneath the calm exterior, subtle cues betrayed intentions, motivations, and knowledge. Purbright reflected on this quietly, recognizing that the truth often arrived not with drama, but with the delicate cadence of human behavior and social propriety. By the close of the day, he felt the quiet satisfaction that comes with preparation rather than resolution. He had expanded his understanding of the players, traced their interactions, and begun to glimpse the pattern underlying the incidents. The ring, the glove, the locket, and the note were no longer isolated curiosities. They were elements of a carefully arranged sequence designed to provoke observation and perhaps confession. Purbright leaned back in his chair, sipping the last of his tea. The town's routines continued unabated, oblivious to the quiet scrutiny under which they now labored. Yet he knew with patient certainty that the minor disturbances had shifted the equilibrium. Flaxborough, for all its civility, had revealed glimpses of human nature, the nervousness, the curiosity, and the cautious concealment that formed the foundation of the town's character. Tomorrow, he reflected, would bring further insights. With careful observation and polite interrogation, the hidden threads would begin to converge, and the careful orchestration of events would become apparent. For now it was enough to know that Flaxborough, in its gentle rhythms and subdued routines, was revealing its secrets in the most subtle and instructive ways. Purbright closed his notebook, aware that patience and discretion were often the most powerful tools in his possession. The day's reflections had clarified much and obscured little. The path ahead was deliberate, measured, and, above all, quietly persuasive, a path that would, in due course, lead to the unveiling of truths concealed beneath the town's polite exterior. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that seemed to hold the promise of clarity, though Purbright knew that clarity rarely arrived with sunlight alone. Flaxborough, in its habitual decorum, had settled into a tentative routine. Shopkeepers swept their thresholds with mild efficiency. The butcher arranged sausages with careful precision, and the post office queue shuffled with polite discipline. Yet beneath this ordinary rhythm, the incidents of the previous days, the ring, the glove, the locket, the note, continued to create subtle ripples in the town's social consciousness. Purbright arrived at the parish centre shortly before 10 o'clock. The hall was quiet, and the objects of curiosity, the ring and the locket, had been arranged carefully on a side table. He observed the room as he entered, noting minor gestures. Lady Craven adjusting her gloves while pretending to inspect the flower arrangements, Mr. Aldridge lingering near the doorway, as though seeking a reason to remain visible without drawing undue attention, and Mr. Benson fidgeting slightly with the lapels of his coat, a gesture that suggested both anticipation and unease. Purbright began with the simplest of measures, a polite, deliberately casual remark meant to provoke subtle reaction rather than overt confession. "It is curious," he said, lowering his voice slightly so that only those nearby might hear, "how minor objects can attract such attention. A ring, a locket, a simple glove, yet suddenly one observes the faintest changes in posture, the smallest adjustments of habit." Lady Craven, as expected, looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing in polite inquiry. "Indeed, Inspector," she replied smoothly. "One might say that even in a well-ordered town, human nature cannot entirely conceal itself." "Quite so," Purbright murmured, allowing a faint smile to pass unnoticed. He then turned toward the florist. "Mr. Aldridge, have you noticed such changes yourself? Subtle, almost imperceptible?" The florist's lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes flicked to the locket, then to the glove, then back to the inspector. Perhaps," he admitted, hesitating. "But one must be careful not to read too much into minor occurrences." "Of course," Purbright agreed, his tone gentle yet precise, noting the nervous lift of Aldridge's shoulders. Yet occasionally even the most trivial gestures convey a story we might otherwise overlook. By mid-morning, Purbright had initiated a series of these small tests. Each question, remark, or observation was designed to be so innocuous as to seem casual, yet to elicit those minute hesitations and gestures that spoke more loudly than words. He asked Sister Mildred about the arrangement of the refreshments, framing the question in terms of efficiency rather than suspicion. He noted the slight pause before she answered, the delicate adjustment of her gloves, and the careful manner in which she avoided direct eye contact with the locket. Sister Agnes, when questioned about the herb garden, responded with absolute composure, but Purbright observed the subtle tightening of her lips, a minor detail almost invisible to an untrained eye. The choir director, Mr. Benson, became the subject of a carefully orchestrated test. Purbright casually mentioned the timing of the locket's discovery and noted the director's subtle tensing, the brief downward glance, the faint twitch of a finger against his coat. Each minor reaction, seemingly insignificant, accumulated into a pattern, a constellation of small truths that, taken together, suggested awareness beyond innocent observation. Even Lady Craven, who had maintained an air of detached civility, could not entirely disguise her curiosity. Purbright arranged a brief discussion about the history of the flower show, intentionally mentioning the ring and the locket without addressing the note. The deliberate ambiguity prompted a slight change in her posture, a careful tilt of the head, a momentary narrowing of the eyes, enough to indicate interest, if not culpability. By afternoon, the pattern was beginning to emerge. The first suspect, Mr. Jenkins, who had been the object of polite suspicion, now appeared largely irrelevant. The reactions elicited by Purbright's tests suggested that the true orchestration lay elsewhere, in the subtle interplay between the objects and the town's more observant or more secretive residents. Purbright, pausing for a moment by the window, reflected on human behaviour. The town of Flaxborough, with its obsession for civility and propriety, had revealed its character not through overt confession but through hesitations, gestures, and minor evasions. A well-placed question, a carefully framed remark, or the simple act of observing with polite attention had elicited truths that the residents themselves were scarcely aware they had revealed. The day's final test involved the nuns. Purbright, presenting the note casually as though seeking advice on its historical significance, watched closely. Sister Mildred's eyes flicked to the locket, then to the glove, then briefly to the ring. There was a minor pause, an infinitesimal hesitation that suggested recollection, recognition, and perhaps internal conflict. Sister Agnes maintained her composure but avoided direct eye contact, her hands folded tightly in front of her. By the close of the day, Purbright had assembled an intricate mental map of the town's reactions, hesitations, and subtle gestures. Each individual, in their own manner, had revealed pieces of understanding, awareness, or complicity. Yet the full picture remained incomplete. The orchestration of events, the deliberate placement of objects, the minor disturbances, and the subtle social manipulations was not yet fully visible. And so Purbright, patient and deliberately restrained, allowed the town's routine to resume. Flaxborough, in its customary orderliness, seemed oblivious to the subtle forces at work, yet the inspector knew that with careful observation and polite intervention, the hidden truths would soon begin to emerge. The stage was set, the actor's tendencies known, and the pattern of human behaviour carefully traced. All that remained was to allow the next incidents, the final revelations, the converging threads, to bring the full truth into view. The morning arrived with an unusual stillness, the kind of quiet that carries the expectation of observation rather than action. Flaxborough, for all its outward calm, seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that subtle forces beneath the surface were finally aligning toward disclosure. The flower show had receded into memory, the ribbons returned to drawers, and the streets resumed their predictable rhythm. Yet the small disturbances, the ring, the glove, the locket, and the folded note remained fresh in the town's consciousness. Inspector Purbright arrived at the parish centre mid-morning, his steps measured, his presence quiet but deliberate. The hall was empty save for the nuns and the ever-watchful Lady Craven. The velvet bag containing the locket rested prominently on the side table alongside the ring which, despite its apparent insignificance, had become a focal point of attention. Purbright's eyes swept the room, noting posture, gestures, and the subtle exchanges of glances that spoke more than words ever could. He began with the simplest of inquiries, framed in the casual tone that had become his hallmark. "Sister Mildred," he said, "the arrangement of the hall yesterday was most meticulous. Yet I wonder if any of the objects, ring, glove, or locket, were noticed before their discovery." Sister Mildred paused, her hands clasped lightly at her waist. The slight hesitation, almost imperceptible, suggested a conflict between strict propriety and the impulse to disclose. I cannot say," she answered carefully. Everything was arranged as usual. Perhaps something was overlooked, though I doubt it. Purbright nodded, making no immediate comment. He turned to Sister Agnes. "And the garden, when you found the note, was there anything else unusual in the vicinity?" Sister Agnes maintained her composure, but the faintest narrowing of her eyes and the subtle tilt of her head suggested recollection. "Nothing beyond what has already been noted," she replied carefully. "The garden was as it always is." These minor hesitations, while polite, began forming the threads of a larger tapestry. Purbright observed without interruption, allowing the subject's own social instincts to betray more than their words could convey. Lady Craven, meanwhile, lingered near the entrance, her gloved hands crossed in front of her. Purbright addressed her with a deliberate, measured remark. "It is fascinating how objects of little apparent consequence, trivial even, can reveal aspects of character that are otherwise hidden." Her lips pursed, her eyes flicking toward the locket and ring. "Indeed, Inspector," she said evenly, "I have long maintained that even in well-ordered society, small disturbances illuminate human nature." Purbright allowed a faint, almost imperceptible pause before speaking again. "And yet it is also remarkable how the timing and placement of such disturbances can guide our understanding if one observes with patience." By mid-morning, Purbright's careful observations were beginning to coalesce. He noted subtle patterns, the way Sister Mildred avoided direct reference to the glove, the manner in which Sister Agnes's gaze lingered on the locket, the measured, almost protective attention Lady Craven paid to each object. Each gesture, each hesitation was a clue in itself. It was during a brief interlude, as Purbright excused himself to inspect the notes and small objects again, that the pivotal moment occurred. Returning to the hall, he observed a minor, almost unconscious movement. Sister Mildred adjusted the position of the glove on the side table, her fingers brushing against the fabric in a way that betrayed both familiarity and caution. The side detail, small yet telling, suggested more than chance. It suggested deliberate involvement. Purbright's voice, quiet but precise, invited clarification. "Sister Mildred," he said, "the glove appears to have been handled since its discovery. Can you recall how it came to be placed in the garden?" A faint flush rose to her cheeks. She hesitated, folding her hands tightly in front of her. I cannot recall," she said softly, though the slight tremor in her voice hinted at the contrary. Purbright allowed a moment's pause, then leaned slightly forward, his tone gentle but probing. "It is not merely the glove that concerns me, the ring, the locket, and the note. They all suggest an arrangement, deliberate in its simplicity. Yet, one need not speak loudly to reveal knowledge. Sometimes a gesture, a glance, a hesitation suffices." The impact of his words was immediate. Sister Mildred's hands twitched as if she were about to cover the objects, but restrained herself. Sister Agnes, sitting quietly, allowed a brief sigh to escape before regaining composure. Even Lady Craven's keen eyes betrayed a fraction of surprise. She had anticipated observation, but perhaps not so delicately applied. It was in these moments that Purbright's strategy bore fruit. The careful orchestration of questions, the subtle tests of behavior, and the patient observation of gestures and timing converged to illuminate the truth. He had not yet announced it aloud, but the evidence, woven from hesitation, glances, and minor gestures, was already assembled in his mind. By late morning, the atmosphere in the hall had changed imperceptibly. The nuns, previously composed, now exhibited slight signs of unease, their attention occasionally straying to the ring and locket. The subtle clues they had previously overlooked now illuminated under Purbright's polite scrutiny. Mr. Aldridge and Mr. Benson had been observed earlier. and their minor reactions, nervous adjustments, brief glances, hesitations, had been quietly recorded in the inspector's mental map. Purbright, patient as ever, allowed the moment to linger. The town, in its outward calm, was beginning to respond to forces it scarcely recognized. Minor disturbances had illuminated character, hinted at motives, and created a space in which the truth could emerge without confrontation, coercion, or spectacle. As he prepared to consolidate his observations, Purbright understood that the reveal, when it came, would require only calm explanation, linking gestures, hesitation, and minor actions to a coherent sequence. The town's intricate web of propriety and subtlety would provide the resolution if only he guided it gently toward clarity. And so the stage was set for the final sequences, the small acts previously unnoticed, now arranged in the quiet pattern of human behavior, ready to reveal the orchestrator of the minor scandals, the handler of the glove, the placer of the note, and the subtle manipulator behind the seemingly trivial disturbances. Flaxborough waited, unknowing, for the final civil disclosure that would resolve the mysteries quietly, politely, and inevitably. The day began with the crisp clarity of autumn air, yet Flaxborough carried a quiet tension beneath the surface. The town's routines continued with mechanical precision, milk bottles replaced, shop doors opened promptly, and the post office's queue shuffled patiently. Yet the recent incidents, the ring on the refreshment table, the glove among the pansies, the locket beneath the stage, and the folded note in the convent garden, lingered in the town's consciousness like a shadow cast across a sunny street. Inspector Purbright arrived at the parish centre mid-morning, carrying a small notebook and his habitual air of patient observation. The hall, empty save for the nuns and Lady Craven, felt almost theatrical in its stillness, as if the stage had been prepared for a final performance that had yet to commence. The velvet bag containing the locket rested in its usual position, while the ring, now polished to a soft gleam, seemed to occupy a focal point of subtle attention. Purbright moved deliberately, examining each object and the reactions of those present. It was not merely the physical placement that mattered, but the minor hesitations, glances, and gestures that accompanied each encounter. He began to trace connections, linking previously isolated incidents into a coherent sequence. First, the glove. Its placement in the pansies had appeared accidental to most, but Purbright noted its alignment with the flower-bed's central path, a slight, deliberate deviation that suggested knowledge of both the garden and the timing of pedestrian traffic. The person who had placed it was familiar with both the convent grounds and the social choreography of the town's visitors. Next, the locket. Found beneath the judge's table, its discovery had been inevitable once the attention of the hall was drawn to the minor disturbances of the morning, yet its concealment beneath a stage accessible only to those aware of its presence indicated familiarity with the interior and schedule of the flower show. Its contents, a photograph of an unfamiliar man, hinted at a connection to the past rather than any immediate scandal. The ring and the folded note provided the final threads. The ring, innocuous yet conspicuous, had been placed with the intention of drawing attention to the table, while the note in the herb garden suggested deliberate misdirection. It was a quiet orchestration, designed not to threaten or alarm, but to provoke observation, curiosity, and, ultimately, disclosure. Purbright observed the nuns. Sister Mildred's composure was admirable, yet he noted the subtle signs of awareness, the careful positioning of her hands, the slight avoidance eye contact with the locket, and the micro-hesitations when asked about the object's placements. Sister Agnes, while outwardly calm, displayed a momentary tightening of lips when the note was mentioned. Even Lady Craven, with her polished manners and keen observation, had not entirely concealed a flicker of surprise when the subtle patterns were discussed. As the morning progressed, Purbright began to draw explicit connections aloud, framing them as casual musings rather than accusations. "It is fascinating," he remarked gently, "how seemingly minor events, the discovery of a glove, a ring, a locket, or even a folded note, can reveal knowledge of places and times that at first glance might seem unrelated. Yet when traced carefully, the patterns suggest deliberate awareness, intention, and subtle orchestration." Sister Mildred's fingers twitched slightly. The brief, involuntary movement spoke more than words could convey. She adjusted her gloves as though to occupy her hands, an instinctive attempt to mask awareness. Purbright observed without interruption, cataloguing every minute gesture, every almost imperceptible reaction. He continued, noting Mr. Aldridge's minor tics, glances toward the locket, slight forward leanings and nervous readjustments of his coat, as further evidence of engagement with the objects beyond casual curiosity. Mr. Benson's hesitations, while more subtle, suggested awareness of timing and placement that aligned with the sequence of events. By mid-afternoon, the constellations of behavior and minor actions began to form a clear pattern. Purbright, in his calm, deliberate manner, drew the threads together. The orchestrator of the disturbances was someone familiar with the convent grounds, aware of the social choreography of the flower show, and adept at managing the town's perception without overtly alarming anyone. The deliberate placement of objects and careful timing pointed toward both observation and subtle manipulation, exactly the kind of pattern that could only be orchestrated by someone intimately acquainted with both the events and the players. Purbright allowed a moment of quiet reflection. In Flaxborough, civility and propriety often concealed motives that were revealed only through hesitation, minor gestures, and careful attention to social nuance. It was the interplay of these behaviors rather than the objects themselves that illuminated the true sequence of events. By evening, he had mentally mapped the sequence. The glove, locket, ring, and note were deliberate cues, each designed to provoke observation and ultimately confession. The patterns of behavior he had observed, hesitations, gestures, glances, and subtle adjustments, identified the orchestrator without need for confrontation or overt accusation. Purbright, patient and methodical, recognized that the final disclosure would require only calm explanation. The town's own rhythms, once subtly guided, would allow the truth to emerge quietly and civilly, with the residents themselves providing the context for understanding. Flaxborough, in its habitual routine, had unwittingly prepared the stage. The minor disturbances had illuminated character, revealed hidden knowledge, and created the conditions necessary for revelation. Purbright, quietly confident in his observations, awaited the moment when the final act would unfold. The morning light filtered softly through the stained glass of the parish centre, illuminating the hall with gentle warmth. Outside, Flaxborough followed its usual rhythms. Shopkeepers arranged their wares with diligent care, the postman made his rounds with polite regularity, and the streets echoed faintly with the shuffle of orderly footsteps. Yet inside the hall, a quieter tension held sway, a tension born not of fear, but of subtle anticipation. Inspector Purbright arrived early, as always, carrying only a notebook and a measured air of unobtrusive authority. Today's task was delicate. He intended not to accuse outright, but to create conditions under which the orchestrator of the minor disturbances might reveal themselves through gesture, hesitation, or inadvertent admission. The stage, carefully prepared, relied on civility and observation rather than confrontation. Sister Mildred and Sister Agnes were already present, attending to the locket and glove with composed attentiveness. Lady Craven lingered near the entrance, gloves clasped, eyes flicking toward the objects with a practiced neutrality that betrayed subtle curiosity. Purbright moved among them with his habitual calm, noting posture, timing, and the interplay of glances, gestures, and pauses. He began gently. "It is remarkable," he said in a tone that suggested casual reflection, "how minor objects, trivial, almost accidental, can provoke attention, reflection, and sometimes revelation. A glove here, a locket there, even a folded note left in a garden." Sister Mildred's fingers tightened around the edge of a chair. She shifted slightly, a small, unconscious movement that caught Purbright's eye. Sister Agnes, outwardly serene, allowed a faint sigh to escape before regaining composure. Lady Craven's eyes, sharp and alert, flicked toward the ring, then to the locket, then briefly to the nuns, as if tracking the flow of attention. Purbright paused, letting silence serve as a probe. The absence of immediate response drew out reactions, micro-expressions, subtle postural adjustments, a hint of tension in the hands. He observed, patient and unhurried, noting each as a thread in the pattern he had meticulously constructed over several days. Then he spoke more pointedly, still in his gentle, civility-cloaked manner. "I cannot help but notice that certain gestures, certain hesitations, recur in response to these objects. It is not the objects themselves that are revealing, but the manner in which they are regarded." Sister Mildred's eyes widened imperceptibly. Her hands moved briefly toward the locket, then paused as if reconsidering. Purbright's gaze, calm and direct, held her attention without pressure. Sister Agnes's lips pressed together lightly, an unconscious sign of awareness. Lady Craven, maintaining her composed demeanor, subtly leaned forward, an acknowledgement of the unfolding situation. Purbright allowed another pause. Then casually, as if discussing a matter of general curiosity, he mentioned the sequence of events. The glove discovered among the pansies, the locket beneath the judge's table, the ring on the refreshment table, the note left in the garden. They form a chain, each linked to the others by timing, placement, and awareness. One cannot arrange such events without familiarity with the spaces, the people, and the patterns of observation. Sister Mildred's hand trembled slightly as she rested it on the table. Her composure, so carefully maintained, showed the first signs of genuine strain. Purbright, noting this, allowed the moment to linger, giving her the opportunity to speak voluntarily. Finally, in a soft voice, almost a whisper, she spoke. "Inspector, I did not intend. I only wanted to guide." Purbright inclined his head, allowing her words to settle. "Guide?" he prompted gently. "To show the sequence, the pattern," she admitted, eyes cast downward, "so that the town might see, understand, the care taken, the order behind what seemed accidental." The admission, understated and polite, revealed the truth without the need for accusation. Sister Mildred had orchestrated the minor disturbances, placing objects and subtly guiding attention to illuminate both human behavior and the town's capacity for observation. Her motives were not malicious but pedagogical, aimed at revealing patterns rather than causing harm. Purbright allowed a moment of quiet reflection. And so the objects, the note, the timing, everything was deliberate. Yet no one was harmed, and the intention was observation rather than mischief. Sister Mildred nodded, a small smile of relief appearing. "Yes, Inspector, I wished only to show the subtle truths hidden in ordinary actions." Lady Craven, observing the exchange, inclined her head politely, her expression one of thoughtful approval rather than surprise. Even Sister Agnes relaxed slightly, her own composure restored by the acknowledgement of Sister Mildred's transparency. Purbright, quietly satisfied, made brief notes in his notebook. The orchestration had been revealed through observation, polite probing, and careful attention to gestures and hesitations rather than confrontation. Flaxborough, for all its civility, had witnessed subtle truths emerge without disruption, scandal, or spectacle. By mid-afternoon, the hall had returned to calm. The objects, glove, ring, locket, and note, were collected and arranged with ceremonial care, while the town's residents, having been informed of the sequence in a calm, civil explanation, absorbed the truth with polite interest rather than dramatic scandal. Purbright observed from his usual chair, content in the knowledge that patience, subtlety, and careful attention to human behavior had brought the matter to resolution. The town's rhythms were restored, yet the memory of minor disturbances and the quiet revelation of hidden patterns would linger subtly in conversation and observation, a testament to the power of civility and discretion. The hall of the parish centre was quiet, suffused with the soft light of late afternoon, the kind of gentle illumination that seemed to invite reflection and calm. Flaxborough's streets outside moved with familiar precision, shopkeepers arranging wares, the butcher weighing meat with practiced care, and pedestrians exchanging polite greetings. Within, however, the air carried a subtle tension, the residue of days of minor disturbances now poised for explanation. Inspector Purbright rose from his chair, notebook in hand, and addressed the small assembly, Sister Mildred, Sister Agnes, Lady Craven, and the few residents who had been present during the flower show's minor upheavals. His voice, calm and measured, carried a deliberate authority, yet was softened by a tone of gentle civility. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "over the past several days, a sequence of seemingly unrelated events has captured our attention. The glove found among the pansies, the locket beneath the judge's table, the ring on the refreshment table, and the folded note left in the convent garden. Each of these objects, though minor, has had the capacity to reveal patterns of behavior, human tendencies, and subtle truths about observation, timing, and intent." He paused briefly, allowing his words to settle, observing reactions. Sister Mildred's hands were folded in her lap, her posture attentive. Lady Craven's eyes, sharp and alert, followed the inspector carefully. Even Sister Agnes, maintaining her customary composure, allowed a faint flicker of curiosity to show in her gaze. Purbright continued, tracing the threads of the minor disturbances with careful precision. The glove, placed among the pansies, was not simply forgotten or misplaced. Its position, aligned with the garden path, suggested knowledge of both the space and the flow of visitors. The locket, hidden beneath the judge's table, was positioned so that discovery was inevitable once attention had been drawn elsewhere. The ring, seemingly innocuous, served to attract focus and guide perception. And the note, placed in the garden, introduced a further layer of observation, prompting reflection rather than alarm. Sister Mildred's hands twitched slightly as she listened. Purbright's eyes met hers with quiet assurance. "It becomes evident," he continued, "that these actions were deliberate, guided by a desire not to deceive or harm, but to reveal. The orchestrator of these minor disturbances possesses knowledge of the town's routines, the spaces in which we operate, and the behaviors of its residents." He allowed another pause, gentle but pointed. The orchestrator, having familiarity with both the convent grounds and the social choreography of the flower show, arranged these objects to provoke reflection and observation. It is through subtle gestures, hesitations, glances, and micro-movements that the truth has emerged rather than through overt confession or dramatic confrontation. Sister Mildred finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Inspector, I wished only to guide attention, to reveal that patterns exist even in ordinary actions, that small gestures and minor occurrences can illuminate human behavior. It was never my intention to cause harm, only to instruct and reveal. Purbright inclined his head, precisely so. The objects, the timing, the placement, they were instruments through which observation could be refined and understanding extended. It is a subtle form of guidance, one that relies on patience, civility, and careful attention to human nature. Lady Craven, her expression measured yet approving, inclined her head. "A delicate and fascinating exercise," she commented. "It is rare for such lessons to be conducted without disrupting the order of the town." "Indeed," Purbright replied. "Flaxborough's civility, its adherence to routine, and the subtle awareness of its residents have allowed this orchestration to function without alarm. The lesson, if one may call it such, is that the smallest of disturbances can reveal the greatest of truths when observed with care." He paused once more, surveying the group. "Thus, the mystery of the glove, the locket, the ring, and the note is resolved. Each object was deliberate, each placement calculated, and the sequence has revealed the orchestrator, the intent, and the subtle mechanisms by which human behavior can be observed and understood." Sister Mildred's hands relaxed in her lap. Sister Agnes nodded faintly, and Lady Craven's smile was faint but genuine. Even the minor observers present, who had arrived purely out of curiosity, seemed satisfied with the calm explanation, understanding the sequence without the need for drama or accusation. Purbright closed his notebook, his expression reflecting quiet satisfaction. The minor disturbances had been explained, the orchestration revealed, and the town's rhythms restored. Flaxborough, for all its outward propriety, had demonstrated once more that civility, careful observation, and patience were often more revealing than confrontation or spectacle. With the explanation complete, the hall settled into calm. The velvet bag containing the locket was returned to its place, the glove and ring carefully arranged, and the folded note preserved as a reminder of subtle instruction rather than mischief. The town outside continued its usual rhythms, unaware of the full measure of understanding quietly achieved within its centre. Purbright remained in his chair for a few moments longer, reflecting on the process. Observation, patience, civility, these had revealed what mere curiosity could not. The town's minor disturbances had illuminated character, behavior, and intention without need for scandal or accusation. Flaxborough, in its orderly precision, had once again shown that even the smallest details attended to carefully could unveil truths far greater than appearances suggested. And in that calm, measured understanding, the inspector found quiet satisfaction, knowing that the town's civility had been preserved, the minor mystery resolved, and human nature subtly illuminated. The morning sunlight spilled gently across Flaxborough, illuminating the familiar streets with a soft clarity. Shop windows gleamed, the baker's scent of fresh bread mingled with the crisp autumn air, and the postman's bell announced arrivals with punctual regularity. To any casual observer, the town moved as it always had, orderly, civil, and untroubled. Yet within the parish centre the subtle echoes of the recent disturbances lingered quietly, a reminder of how minor events could illuminate human nature. Inspector Purbright arrived mid-morning, notebook tucked under his arm, his expression calm and deliberate. The hall was empty save for Sister Mildred, who had returned the glove, ring, and locket to their places with careful attention. The folded note, preserved as a minor curiosity rather than a source of scandal, rested on a side table, and the atmosphere was one of gentle civility restored. Purbright allowed himself a small moment of reflection. The minor orchestrations, previously a source of mild puzzlement and gossip, had been resolved with civility, observation, and the quiet revelation of subtle human behavior. No accusation had been necessary, no town scandal had erupted. Instead, understanding had emerged from gestures, hesitations, and polite acknowledgement. Sister Mildred approached, her hands neatly folded. "Inspector," she said softly, "I hope the town is not too unsettled by my attempts at demonstration." Purbright inclined his head. "Not at all, sister. Your careful orchestration has revealed much about observation, timing, and attention to minor details. Flaxborough has been given a gentle lesson in human nature without harm or disruption." Sister Agnes, standing nearby, offered a faint smile. "It seems that civility, combined with observation, suffices where speculation might otherwise lead to scandal." "Precisely," Purbright agreed. "And the town itself, with its adherence to routine and propriety, has provided the stage for such observation. The sequence of events, the glove, the locket, the ring, and the note, has been understood and resolved without the need for dramatic confrontation. That is perhaps the most instructive outcome of all." Lady Craven, having arrived to witness the final disposition of the objects, inclined her head politely. "A most civil and discreet resolution," she commented. "I suspect the residents will recall it with curiosity rather than alarm." Indeed, outside the hall, Flaxborough continued with its orderly rhythm. The minor gossip about the flower show and its unexpected incidents had already begun to settle into the usual pattern of polite speculation. Shopkeepers exchanged quiet comments, the butcher offered a mild smile as he weighed sausages, and passers-by continued their routines without disruption. The town's civility, intact, allowed minor curiosity to exist alongside normalcy rather than overt scandal. Purbright took his seat at the table, notebook open, and began the quiet work of documentation. The objects, glove, locket, ring, note, were accounted for, observations carefully recorded, and the sequence of events summarized with attention to detail. He noted the subtle behaviors, the micro-gestures, and the hesitations that had revealed the orchestrator and the intent behind the disturbances. As the day progressed, residents came and went, offering polite greetings to the inspector. Each encounter was met with measured attention and gentle civility, reinforcing the quiet conclusion of the mystery. The town had returned to normal, yet the memory of minor disturbances and the demonstration of subtle human observation lingered like faint footprints in an otherwise pristine path. Purbright reflected on the nature of civility and human behavior. The town, in its structured routines and attention to propriety, had provided both the stage and the participants for a minor but illuminating mystery. The orchestrator had acted with intention, not malice. Observation had revealed the pattern, and understanding had emerged quietly, civilly, and completely. By late afternoon, the parish centre had returned to its usual stillness. The objects were placed with ceremonial care, and the minor curiosity they inspired would, in time, settle into the town's memory as a subtle lesson in attentiveness. Sister Mildred moved quietly among the tables, arranging items with careful precision, while Sister Agnes offered a faintly approving glance. Lady Craven, still observant but now entirely relaxed, prepared to depart. Purbright, finally rising, closed his notebook with deliberate satisfaction. The town's rhythms had resumed, civility remained intact, and subtle truths had been revealed without disruption or scandal. The minor disturbances, the glove, the locket, the ring, and the note, had served their purpose: to illuminate, instruct, and resolve with quiet dignity. As he stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, Purbright allowed himself a small, rare smile. Flaxborough had quietly fulfilled its role in the unfolding of human nature, and the inspector, patient, civil, and observant as ever, could return to his quiet work, confident that order, understanding, and civility had prevailed.